So welcome, Peter. Welcome, Susan. The first question from the several questions that we're getting that I think it's important to address, and it's actually two questions that are connected, has to do with a given device candidate that once in the ShipMD system. The question is if that device will be required to stay within the selected hospitals for that device candidate to run the evidence generation within the ShipMD network for longer than it takes to get the FDA clearance. That's the first question. And there's one that is connected to that one, but I'll let you guys comment on that first one.
Susan, you want to take a stab at that first?
I think the general concept here is for organizations to come into SHIP, and there's no binding contract. They can leave or exit SHIP at any time. While they're in the SHIP system, we would like them to maintain an exclusive relationship with the SHIP hospitals. Again, to John's point, the efficiency of scale, making sure that we can effectively and in a financially sound way conduct these studies. I don't know if John or Kalala have anything else to add.
No, that's great, Susan. I totally agree. One nuance I wanted to mention, and it may or may not be related to the question that was asked, but it's important also to understand that the device development is very iterative. So a version of the device that may enter the study, it may not, and often is not necessarily the version that will get cleared by the FDA. So throughout the study, it will go through many iterations, and that is exactly why it's important to have a team on site, the physicians and perhaps, some biomedical engineers who can work in collaboration with the device sponsor to accommodate those type of changes.
We want to be as inclusive as possible in this process. No one is tying you up and saying that you can't engage other consultants, other input from other sources. It's very important to understand that we're being flexible. If people want to participate, we think this is going to really give you great opportunities and leverage a lot of opportunities to work within a highly functioning system. And also, at the same time, if you decide that you don't want to participate anymore, there's not going to be any legal language in your contracts that says you can't walk out the door. So this is it's a public-private partnership, as we've talked about. It's voluntary. And I think when people start leveraging the system, they're going to recognize how critically important this is to their operation and want to stay.
Klaus, this is Peter.
Yep.
Well, I just wondered if I might address a comment that John made during his presentation, and it relates to surgically implanted devices. And I made a comment yesterday during the panel discussion. Just a little bit, my background, I'm a pediatric orthopedic surgeon and currently serve as the Chief Medical Officer for OrthoPediatrics, which is an orthopedic device company focused entirely on children and adolescents. When an implantable device is developed, a company, and this is not just orthopedics, I'm sure it applies to any of the specialties, surgeons are brought together who have a particular expertise in that condition and the clinical and surgical management of that condition. And they play a significant role in the design development of the implant, the instruments that are used to implant it, and then one of the things that they do is to develop a very specific surgical technique. And so the point that I made yesterday, it's important when a company brings a device into the ShipMD that first of all, you have the expertise, you have the surgeons that know that disease entity, that know the surgical management of that. But the other critical piece is that they follow the surgical technique for that device, because it's important to have consistency in the use of the implant and the instruments to fairly be able to evaluate that device. So I just want to make that point clear. It's very important to have the expertise and then have them agree to follow the technique that was developed for that implant. Thank you.
Yes, no, great point. That connects with the point Kalala made, and the notion that what we're really talking about is establishing a learn and confirm paradigm, where the wheel continuously move from learning to confirming to learning to confirming, and then the outward-looking FDA clearance, reimbursement discussions come out of that wheel as that wheel continuously spins within ShipMD. I think that's a key concept to also keep in mind. But then there's a related question to this, or rather, there's at least three questions that all point to the same topic, which is how will the hospitals that participate in ShipMD be selected? So if you guys can comment on the selection criteria, the who's going to have to vet that, how the criteria will be defined, and how the hospitals will be selected in that wheels and spoke paradigm that you described.
Carl, you want to start?
John, and I can chime in after you.
Yeah, I don't know that any of us have absolute criteria written in stone at this stage. This is going to be an evolving process. But with that said, I think Kalali nicely described institutions that will give you sufficient patient populations, sufficient geographic and ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic diversity, with existing experience in clinical trials of devices, qualified investigators, etc., being able to accept a single IRB and single contracting mechanisms. And we could probably go on for quite some time, and I'll be interested in what some of my co-panelists think about that as well. But certainly, we're also going to be very interested in the spokes. You know, this is a public-private partnership. We don't think that a single hospital alone may be sufficient. Maybe it will be under the circumstances, and maybe it won't be. We want to be able to address hospitals like Peters, Shriners hospitals that are very, very important and do a huge amount of orthopedic surgery. Maybe they'll be one of the spokes. Maybe it'll be a birth-related hospital, and where you will have access to newborns who have a variety of conditions that may not be transferred to a children's hospital. Maybe you'll have hospitals that are specialized for children with behavioral issues or autism or others where you want to test your device, and there aren't a lot of inpatient beds in children's hospitals for children with psychiatric disease or other behavioral health problems. So I think all of those things are going to be taken into account. There should be a committee that will look at that, and I think whether that will be organized through CPATH, I think we're still up in the air, Klaus, as how that'll actually work. Sometimes it's been done with places like the NIH Foundation. Sometimes we're going to have a data coordinating center selected with a variety of investigators and representatives from government, et cetera, in that data coordinating center. Will they participate in the process? I think these are all things that we're going to consider and think about.
Yeah.
You know, while there is going to be flexibility, especially when we talk about the spokes, I do believe that there, you know, to reassure our stakeholders, will be some a priori criteria, especially for the hubs, so that there is a clear understanding by way of hospitals with respect to who's going to qualify, and for our sponsors that are coming in to have an understanding of the types of hospitals that will be available to manage the process.
I just want to add that, starting small and scaling fast may be the way to go. And as John mentioned yesterday in his talk, the CTSA network is a good example of that. It started small with a network of about 8 hospitals, and now it's a 60 hospital, or I should say academic medical center network.
Yeah, absolutely. So hearing what the points that you're making, and especially a point that Susan raised, I think the message to the audience right now is the concept that is being proposed is one in which there will be a triangulation between the type of device being considered to move through SHIP, the kind of requirements and criteria that a hospital would need to fulfill in order to be able to handle that evidence generation requirements for that specific device. And then the hubs and spokes for the selection of those hospitals will be based on those criteria, but those criteria will need to be defined in a tangible way with tangible examples rather than try to come up with those criteria a priori. But there's, of course, criteria that can be defined in the next few months, but then the specificity of which hospitals have what it takes will come later, and then their participation will be considered on that. Is that a fair summary of the conceptual framework right now?
I think to some extent that's fair. I do want to reassure again our audience that this is not going to be necessarily happening on the fly. So part of that early work that John has described as it relates to feasibility will really be looking at the capacity of these applicant hospitals to manage various types of devices. And obviously we can't consider everything, but we want to be able to respond when devices hit SHIP in a relatively timely fashion.
Yeah, excellent point, Susan. So one aspect related to this, and this is a question that is a really important one, if you put a device through SHIP, who is going to own the IP? And I think this question has been asked in pretty much every single panel. So if you can comment on that, that'd be great as well.
I can get started on that because I am also the managing director of Innovation Ventures at Children's National, which is the equivalent of tech transfer in many organizations. I will give an answer of it depends. I think generally we should follow IP law. It's very clear cut, so it all depends. So your IP is your IP, mine is mine, anything joint is a joint IP. So we mentioned that we're going to have a set of pre-approved templates in place. One of them is an interinstitutional agreement that will spell out all the IP provisions. So for all participating hospitals as well as sponsors, we will have that pre-approved template in place. So provisions such as IP are clear and pre-negotiated before a study starts.
I think we really don't see SHIP as an entity that it's going to hold IP. And I think we're all pretty clear with that. I think as you come in to this process, you own your IP. And we're setting this up really as a service organization for you to be able to conduct your studies. And so we think as you come in with your IP, it's your IP. And obviously you can choose to enlist investigators or institutions to help you make substantial changes in it, things of that nature. That's really your decision and not anything to do with SHIP.
Time to also point out that there will be a careful evaluation of conflict of interest, so that if we have participating hospitals that are also innovating in the same space, we'll make sure that there's a clear separation there so that the IP of the respective organizations can be protected.
Excellent. Thank you for those insightful comments about that really important question. Related to the question about the devices and the hospitals and how to move them along, there's a question from the audience pertaining to the fact that in the case study that you guys presented, you talk about therapeutic devices. And the question is about other types of devices, specifically diagnostic devices and diagnostic devices that can have a level of complexity that require some careful additional consideration, like, for example, diagnostic purposes for sleep disorders that require that additional complexity, but with the added potential advantage of having those monitors be placed in a home setting. So can you comment on those other types of devices and how SHIP can help those?
Yeah, I may start, and I think, oh, go ahead, Kalali.
No, please go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, so I mean, diagnostic interventions are something that I don't see as distinct from therapeutic devices when we're talking about the ability of SHIP to contribute to that process. So your hospitals will have similar expertise in launching and implementing a diagnostic as they will a therapeutic device, and will ensure that the expertise is there to facilitate a device like that moving through the system.
I think we see outpatient devices, diagnostics of therapeutic, just as important as inpatient, and we want the system to be flexible enough to be able to handle all types of devices. As Kalali says, everywhere, anyone from a class 1 device that really has minimal risk to some of the implantable devices that Peter has discussed. And so some of that is going to be managed at home. It may be a cardiac monitor that a child is on, or a wearable sensor that's wireless, and just testing that out at home. Those may be quite important. So I think there's going to be lots of opportunities, and we want to be, again, as inclusive as possible and set the system up to be responsive to the sponsors. That's who we're here to help. If you don't come to us and you don't find that our system works, then we've all lost. We have set this up as a win-win operation. And, you know, it really needs to be done. We've had a lot of drug development in pediatrics. We've had legislation passed. We've pushed people in that direction. It's not perfect, but it's much better. And now is the time to really focus on the device side of things as well, so children really benefit from the same innovation than adults. And someone once said to me, well, if not now, when? And if not us, who? And it really is the case that we've all rolled up our sleeves and have said, now is the time that we really need to do that. And CPAF has really catalyzed those discussions.
Yeah, I think our audience member might be surprised to learn just how many pediatric hospitals are really engaging in trials that involve community setting, not just an outpatient setting, but actually, as John mentioned, wearables and other at-home monitoring devices. So the capacity is there. It's being built and it exists.
Excellent. Fighting the mute button here for a second. So, yeah, absolutely. Very valid points. Now, but so far we've discussed, and you guys have given insight as to the responsiveness of the system to react appropriately and quickly to help an innovator, a device manufacturer, or even a hospital that has an innovation to move that through the system. But what about the hospitals also being proactive in activities like setting up their own quote-unquote trial-ready cohorts that might be at the ready, so that when a sponsor comes to SHIP with the idea of a device for a particular indication, another aspect of this can be the connection with those hospitals that have those populations already identified and to a degree captured in something like a registry or things of that nature, so that the recruitment process can also be expedited. Can you comment on that proactive component of the vision of the hospital participation in SHIP?
So we have a trial innovation network through the CTSA consortium. The CTSA consortium is a $500 million grant from the NCATS, and it's the largest grant program in all of NIH. And we do cohort discovery routinely. So when a sponsor or an investigator approaches us, and it's usually through NIH, with a potential trial, we can do cohort discovery in a few days. Now with the electronic health records, it's not going to take weeks or months to tell you where the patients are. With a couple of clicks, you can find where those patients are really very, very quickly. And coming into SHIP, you may say, well, before I jump in, how many patients am I going to have access to who would meet criteria for my study and have these specific lesions, diagnoses, etc. That kind of information can be obtained really quickly. So it's not that we have to have things set up already. Those kinds of cohort discoveries can be done, and you can identify these types of patients very, very quickly.
Thanks, John. Any other comments from the panel about that topic?
I want just to add that registries are very important in device studies. Specifically, when let's say a surgeon or pediatrician finds themselves using a device off-label for so many years, many of them have also created a registry around that. So they have collected, safety data for their own sake, and having that in place. A good example is the Congenital Heart Disease Consortium, the pediatric consortium that has created a fantastic registry for these patients. So I think that, out of necessity, some hospitals and some cohorts of hospitals, some networks had to be proactive and create that type of infrastructure.
Yeah, cool, Ali. And you bring up a really good point that necessity is the mother of invention. But speaking about those kinds of inventions, you bring up a good topic of what happens after, right? So we talked about the trial-ready cohort discovery aspect. We've talked about putting the candidate devices through the SHIP system to generate the evidence that is needed for having the supporting the conversations with the regulators and the reimbursement conversations, all that. But then what happens after you hit the market and you are in a reimbursement setting, that things don't stop, getting back to the learning confirmed paradigm, because you bring up an aspect that is quite important these days, the notion of real world data and the transformation of those data into real world evidence. And for things not just to the continuous monitoring that is needed, that you guys mentioned in the presentation, as part of the thinking of device development, but also the notion of how that evidence could also be used to consider labeling expansions. So do you see that happening as well in terms of having that be a component of SHIP?
The litigation team addressed that nicely the other day, and they talked about the flexibility of staying in SHIP even post-approval to collect this additional post-market information. So that's certainly an opportunity for sponsors to stay within SHIP and continue to collect that information.
John, it looks like you want to make a comment. Oh, you're muted. No, you're good. Okay, I thought you were going to introduce a comment. Okay, great. That's amazing. And so another question that we have about yet another type of devices, and those are the artificial intelligence-based algorithms and the clinical decision support system type devices, and how you guys see that as a component, or how that would work within the SHIP system?
There is a category of software as a medical device, which these AI algorithms would fall under, and we are seeing the need for hospitals to get engaged with device sponsors is increasing, especially post-COVID. So certain predictive analytics have become very hot topics. So I would definitely see software as a medical device as being covered under the SHIP. It's under the auspices of CDRH, and why not? Yeah.
Continue to evolve over time, Klaus, right? And so it's hard to anticipate every kind of device. But for instance, now, genomic sequencing data is changing so fast. These machines from Illumina are $1 million a piece and being upgraded constantly. And so there'll be certainly devices like that for sequencing, for devices for specific targeted genomic panels or platforms. Everything's going to evolve over time. There'll be machine learning. And we found from a number of our genomic trials that a lot of it depends on these algorithms. We have some labs that will find a specific gene defect and give us a diagnosis of a genetic disease, and another lab running the exact same testing at a different time using a slightly different platform doesn't find it. And a lot of it is based on the algorithms that they use to interpret. So I think that's very, very important, and we're hoping that this system will be set up to look at a variety of different hardware and software potential applications.
Great, because that's also a very relevant point for like imaging devices and those kinds of things, the underlying algorithms that you need to demonstrate. And so that's a key component of the evidence generation piece as well. So we're back to the learn and confirm paradigm, which is great. Now, related to, and you mentioned this, the CTSA framework, John, there is a question in the audience about the linkage and networking and participation and partnership with other entities that are out there, like IAC and Action Network, et cetera. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, again, we want to be as inclusive as possible. We're hoping that IAC, and IAC stands for the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children, and it is an entity set up through CPATH and the FDA to conduct clinical trials in children. And so there's a number of pharmaceutical companies and now device companies approaching IAC to help them conduct their clinical trials. We could easily see an organization such as that working with this system. I don't think it's going to be standalone and completely siloed. I'm hoping that if there's access to registry data or the Pediatric Trials Network or other networks within the ecosystem that are conducting clinical trials in children, and we think they can be advantageous, why wouldn't we want to include them? How we'll do that and how it'll work, Klaus, you may want to comment on that, because that's what you do at CPATH, is set up consortia. But I think that's the important question. But there is no doubt in my mind that we'll be anxious to incorporate a variety of other organizations within the U.S., regulatory efforts within the U.S., and potentially even abroad. As a device developer says, well, in the U.S. they're asking me to do one thing and the EMA is asking me to do something else. Do we have the opportunity to get those two regulatory agencies together under this mechanism to try to resolve some of those differences? We actually have been very successful doing that in the drug space, where we've had companies with very different requirements, very frustrated, and we've gotten all the regulatory agencies in different places together on the phone at any one time to try to resolve those differences. Now, that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's set it up in the U.S. first and worry about global efforts, but I think those opportunities will exist.
Excellent. And in fact, we were the driving force behind IACT, but IACT is you can call that a spin-off from CPAS. So it's going to be an interesting one. So in terms of the question about the getting things practically going, there is a question about something that you emphasized in your presentation, John, about the IRB process and the centralization and the efficiencies that could be gained. But could you comment also on the potential challenges of setting that up the right way from the beginning, so that the SHIP process doesn't end up getting caught in that potential hurdle and affecting the timelines?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. We've already set this up for the CTSA network. It's called the SMART IRB, and it's a reliance model. So what happens is already that hospitals have agreed and signed agreements through the CTSA program. They would do this through the SHIP program as well, to rely on other IRBs. And so NIH requires it. So every institution participating in an NIH-sponsored multi-site clinical trial of a therapeutic, diagnostic, anything, has to agree to a single IRB model. So that already exists. So we would not be rediscovering the wheel all over again. So what happens is you rely on one specific institution to be your IRB of record. Now, all the other IRBs don't wash their hands and say they're done. They look at local context, state laws, local laws, and requirements, and they can insert that language into the informed consent process. They're also involved in compliance. If there's any malfeasance or anything else going on, the local IRB takes that on. But otherwise, the central IRB works extremely well. I mean, it's not perfect, and we're getting better, but in general, this process seems to streamline things. Because again, your protocol goes in, and if you have 10 sites or 12 sites, all of them get approved at the exact same time. If you have a continuing review or an amendment, it's only one time that the IRB will meet, and then it's approved for all the different sites. So again, that process exists. We've already started sharing documents with CPATH and others from that SMART IRB model, and that's something that could be adopted really very quickly.
Klaus, would you mind if I asked a couple of questions that were provided to me by industry colleagues?
Please.
So the first one of the things we haven't talked a lot about is the cost. And so one of the questions that was provided to me, would hospitals use SHIP programs as a significant profit generator, the way they now often overcharge companies for drug and PMA-type device clinical trials?
Anyone on the panel?
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead. Please go ahead.
I can comment from our perspective. So I'm not quite sure what the experience of the person asking the question is, but for us, I would say at the majority of trials that we run are either run at a loss or run at net neutral. So for us, it's not a profit-generating venture. We undertake studies where we believe it's the right thing to do for children, and it's something that's needed. I don't believe that that's the intention with SHIP. And as John mentioned, this single IRB, there's also the concept of a kind of a single contractual process that's agreed upon by all hospitals as part of the SHIP process. And I think Kalali or John could speak to that more, but that level of control of cost will be managed to some extent by the SHIP process.
And that's why I mentioned that C-level contribution and support of SHIP becomes very important because this is not a money-making proposition for the hospitals. Just like Sue mentioned, we either lose money, subsidize these trials, and at best maybe break even. But I think that's probably like 20% of the time or less. But often, hospitals actually have skin in the game when they get into the clinical trials business.
I think more and more of these contracts and grants and others pay you per patient. And most of the time in pediatrics, we're dealing with rare diseases. So yes, there are certainly some types of therapeutics if we're dealing with, say, a premature infant, and we've got lots of those. We can enroll patients relatively quickly. If some of these devices are designed for rare diseases that you're not seeing often, or drugs, some of the times we may only see 1 or 2 patients a year. So we have to keep these protocols open. We have to keep the IRB approvals. We have to keep everybody trained and ready, and we may only see 2 patients a year because it's an extremely rare condition. So yes, I know for many sponsors, when you're negotiating these contracts, it seems like you're paying through the teeth, and yet we're getting it on the other side as investigators saying we're losing money, on this particular trial. And if we think we lose money through some of these sponsors, you lose even more money through NIH and some of these other national sponsors. So it is a complicated process, probably beyond the scope of all of us here. But I agree with Susan. We're going to do everything we can to streamline the process. If you can cut a year off your clinical trial, how much is that worth?
Sure.
Yeah.
The fair market value standards as well. So that's something to think about, with some of these institutions. But I would extend what John said beyond the consolidating time is ensuring you've got the quality data that you need to support your submission to the agency. So, and on the drug side, I can't tell you how many times we've quality assured data coming from well-experienced children's hospitals versus CROs that don't really have much pediatric experience, and identified some major gaps in the quality of the data that were generated. So that's another aspect to consider as well.
So hopefully that answers that question, Peter. The one thing that I would add is that a statement about overcharging implies that there was a comparison. And so back to the fair market value, that comment that Susan made, I think that's an important one because eventually one of the visions for SHIP, and this is something that both Kalali and Jonathan mentioned, it is the fact that there's going to be an economy of scale of that, or at least that's the vision for it, and that's going to help everyone. And the other thing is a point that Susan made. I want to emphasize that one: the generation of the evidence that is needed to inform the conversations with the regulators and the payers. And a lot of times that requires, if you don't really have a learn and confirm paradigm, you're likely going to pay for the generation of evidence that will answer certain questions, but not the questions that are necessarily needed to inform those interactions. So that's, at least in my view, one of the components of the value proposition for SHIP.
Good, thank you very much.
You had another question from industry, Peter?
So the other question, which I think is also a very interesting one, is what questions. Let me sort of rephrase it. So a company brings a device and comes into the system. What involvement will they have in determining that the hospitals assigned to work with them in the SHIP ecosystem actually have the experience that are needed to properly do the study? So that was the second question that I was provided.
I expect that the company is going to be very actively engaged. It's not like, okay, give us your device, go home, and we'll call you anytime you have a child.
Right.
And so we hope that the sponsors, like any trial that they're conducting, it's their device, it's their IP, it's their investment. We think they're going to be critically important to be participating in the process. As you've appropriately mentioned, Peter.
Sure.
When a surgeon puts an implantable device in for the first time, they don't know much about that device yet. And how do they choose the patient and decide they're going to use that device for the first time? It's a complicated process. So we really do want the companies to be engaged in it. They'll know who the PIs are at each of the sites. The hospitals will decide. So if it's a cardiac device, it may be great at Boston Children's Hospital. It's Pedro Del Nido, who is the chief of cardiac surgery. He's going to be your PI. Here's his CV. Here's the number of trials he's done, etc. I don't see why you wouldn't be doing that at each institution. Also reviewing the cohort discovery numbers. Here's the number of patients that we've had of potentially eligible patients in the last few years. And then certainly looking to say, well, and we can try to give you numbers quickly. We have, 4 children in the next year who are going to require surgery, and we think we could use your device during these surgical encounters. So I think we're hoping to be able to provide those data to the sponsors when they come to SHIP to make sure that they're comfortable. And again, Susan brought this up, we're going to have conflict of interest committees there. So if a particular investigator or institution is working in the same space, can we manage that conflict and allow the investigator to continue? Or do we say that investigator and that institution is not going to participate, in this particular trial? And so I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility in the system, but we see, again, to reinforce that if the sponsors aren't happy and they're not coming to the network to conduct their trials, then everybody loses.
Excellent. Well, you understand right now for a lot of people, there's this concept, and they haven't spent, a year like we have working on all these various details. So these questions come up. And obviously, as we get closer to implementation, most of these questions will be addressed right up front. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that speaks back to the notion that for the specific device candidates, there will be very specific criteria of what is needed to generate the necessary evidence, and that will be discussed up front for the selection of the hospitals. And of course, whoever holds the IP for the candidate device needs to be part of that conversation. Absolutely. So we're at the 5-minute mark. I want to thank everybody, especially the folks that are behind the scenes. Laura, Sarah, and Karen on our end, but also our colleagues from Subversive and our colleagues from Lotus Nile for the production of the meeting, the WebEx setup, and the video production. But I want to invite now the colleagues from the panel to make any concluding statements before we close the session.
Thank you so much to the CPAS team, Subversive. I totally agree with you. Everyone who has been behind the scenes working to make this happen. We worked, it was a labor of love to bring the result of our 1-year-long work to this point, and I'm very excited for the next step.
Yeah, I think we've all really committed a lot of time, energy, and effort, and we've done it on our own time without any kind of reimbursement because we believe in the process. I think as pediatricians, we feel very strongly that we need these devices. We really want to make progress, especially with our smallest and most vulnerable patients. And, if you can't commit yourself to help a child, then we're all in the wrong business, and we might as well go home and pack it in. This gives us a unique opportunity, I think, between the FDA and CPATH and all the people who have participated. And I think you've gotten a sense over the last 3 days just how grand scale this effort is And we're doing it for one reason, to give you as the sponsor the opportunity to participate in a process, help us build this. It is a public-private partnership, and you need to help us build this. We really want your feedback. We really want your input, and we want to be as inclusive as possible. So as people have good ideas and think that this is the way to go, we're going to be asking you later this afternoon, do you think we should do this? Do you think you would buy into this process? That's going to be a central tenet of how we decide to move forward.
John, you've said it well.
Go ahead. Sorry, Peter.
No, Susan, you go ahead first.
I was going to say, I'll echo everything that Kalali and John said, but I would just add that this is not intended to be an academic exercise. And our success is measured by the ability of our sponsors and innovators to get their products to market. And so when John and Kalali talk about this being a labor of love and us doing this because it really is the right thing to do, we want this to be successful, to make you successful so that these products can come to market. So there's extensive discussion that's happening with the committees, but your feedback is going to be critical and is vital to what we believe is a success of this program.
And just to emphasize what I think we've all said, we're passionate about this because ultimately it's the children that will benefit. And that's why we're doing this.
To conclude the session, I just want to close with thanks to the audience for all the questions, all the engagement. Again, if you want to get involved in this, just contact us and we'll make sure to bring you into the journey.